Yes.
Okay, so well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 6th and last webinar of this season regarding urban density and quality of life. We have the chance to host Mr. Ahrend tonight, who will give us some more an interesting point of view, a more global view on the different various economic models of the city. And in order to start, let us just have an introductory, and I'd also like to thank the network of Mr. Alfredo Corbalan. People from Munich, Oslo, Wien, and Bratislava are here tonight, so thank you for being here. This webinar will be is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it and watch it and watch it as much as you want while you'll be on holidays on the beach. So that's a good point. And first of all, I'd like to let the director of the Department of Strategy here at perspective.brussels to give us a short welcome word, an introductory word. C'est à vous.
Merci Nicolas. Effectivement, je voulais souhaiter à tout le monde la bienvenue à ce dernier webinaire que nous organisons dans le cadre de l'année thématique autour du concept de densité urbaine. Ik wens u van harte welkom op deze laatste webinar, georganiseerd in het kader van het themajaar over stedelijke dichtheid. Vous avez sans doute, vous avez peut-être appris à nous connaître que Perspective est une jeune institution bruxelloise née en 2015 et qui travaille pour le compte du gouvernement à la définition d'un cadre stratégique et réglementaire pour le développement du territoire bruxellois. Donc, à Perspective, nous nous appuyons sur le travail d'experts statistiques, d'experts territoriaux pour établir des diagnostics précis, mettre en évidence des enjeux territoriaux, des besoins territoriaux et définir sur cette base un cadre pour le développement de la région bruxelloise. De opdrachten van Perspectief situeren zich op alle niveaus, van stratenblokken tot de grootstedelijke of zelfs Europese ruimte via netwerken van metropolen die we samen met onze partners proberen te bouwen. En op alle niveaus zijn de voorwaarden dezelfde: een diagnose verfijnen, de stedelijke problematiek belichten, een visie bepalen en een strategie uitstippelen om die visie te vertalen in concrete stadsprojecten en het leven van de Brusselaars te veranderen. Door deze weg te volgen heeft Perspectief het gewestelijk plan voor duurzame ontwikkeling opgesteld dat in 2018 door de Brusselse regering werd goedgekeurd. Het GPDO, zoals we het noemen, is eigenlijk het Brusselse stadsproject, een mijlpaal, een horizon, een aaneensluiting van projecten en energieën om vorm te geven aan een duurzame en inclusieve stad. De quelle ville avons-nous besoin demain? C'était la question qui était posée à la région bruxelloise au moment d'établir son projet de ville en 2018. Et c'est une question qui se pose aujourd'hui avec encore plus d'intensité, plus d'urgence, alors que nous sommes en train de mesurer les effets de la pandémie sur le développement des villes, sur la vie en ville, sur la vie des citoyens. Et dans ce contexte, le concept de densité urbaine fait débat. Quelle forme urbaine, quelles intensités, quel équilibre trouver pour que la vie en ville soit inclusive et durable? C'est tout le sens des recherches qui ont été menées durant cette année thématique et c'est toute la question qui était posée aux experts que nous avons invités et que nous avons écoutés attentivement à l'occasion de cette année thématique. Je les remercie chaleureusement, je remercie notre invité du jour qui nous fera un exposé sur le concept, enfin sur la question de l'économie urbaine liée à cette thématique de la densité. On vous détaillera tout ça dans le détail, mais donc nous comptons évidemment ne pas nous arrêter là et poursuivre la réflexion en publiant les conclusions de cette année thématique et en la travaillant encore autant que possible dans les mois qui viennent. Encore merci à tous pour votre participation à cette année. Je vous souhaite une excellente séance et je recède la parole à Monsieur Demouy comme président de séance. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for this introductory explanation of this season regarding thematic here and how we want to really give life and give a continuity to our citywide project based on our regional planning, or sustainable regional plan. And let me now introduce you to a short video that's in French but subtitled in English by my colleague Julia and our curator Jérôme. Just bear with me. I'll share my screen and launch a video that will explain to you our work this year.
Territoriale, développer un cadre de vie agréable, durable, attractif, développer une économie urbaine, favoriser le déplacement multimodal durable. Perspective étant poursuivre la dynamique autour de projets de ville et garantir qu'ils puissent à tout moment faire fonction de cadre général pertinent, capable de rendre cohérent entre eux les projets ou les stratégies sectorielles de nombreux acteurs de la ville. C'est l'essence de la mission projecting.brussels, dans le cadre lequel Perspective souhaite mettre en place une planification stratégique dynamique, c'est-à-dire un processus d'actualisation continue de projets de ville en fonction d'évolution de la situation socio-économique et des problématiques urbaines sur lesquelles le projet de ville et le proposer ses solutions. Cette mission se structure autour de 3 axes de travail. Un suivi annuel et transversal d'évolution contextuelle de la région, le pilotage d'une concertation des acteurs régionaux chargés de la mise en œuvre des projets de ville, la réflexion pratique et prospective sur les thématiques des projets de ville. Cette année, donc, la réflexion pratique et prospective se traduit par l'organisation d'une année thématique sur les questions de densité urbaine. L'objectif de cette réflexion est de définir plus concrètement les conditions qui permettront de combiner densité urbaine et la qualité de vie dans les quartiers. Dans ce cadre-là que nous nous retrouvons aujourd'hui avec ce webinaire, je passe les paroles au curateur de l'année thématique densité, Jérôme Baratier. Jérôme, c'est à vous.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je suis Jérôme Baratier, le curateur qui accompagne perspective.brussels dans cette saison dédiée à la densité de qualité. Alors, notre exploration s'achève ce soir avec notre dernier webinaire. Nous avions accueilli Jens Hart qui nous a parlé de densité et santé. Ensuite, David Sim de l'agence GEL nous a parlé de la densité quotidienne. Meta Berghauser de la densité et du rapport entre densité et forme urbaine. Marion Valeur et Philippe Clergeau nous ont parlé du lien entre densité et nature. Et lors de notre dernier webinaire, le précédent, Ahrend nous a parlé de la relation entre densité et architecture. Alors, à partir de ces auditions, de ces webinaires, à partir du benchmark, à partir de nombreuses études qui aujourd'hui permettent d'explorer la densité dans la région de Bruxelles-Capitale, il nous semble qu'on est en capacité de formuler un certain nombre de recommandations qui feront l'objet d'une publication qui est en cours de finalisation. Ces 12 recommandations, elles relèvent à la fois de la question de la mesure. Comment mesure-t-on la densité de qualité et pas simplement un rapport d'habitants sur une surface, des recommandations qui relèvent de la gouvernance, quelles sont les parties prenantes à mobiliser pour ensemble faire émerger cette densité de qualité, des recommandations qui relèvent des outils de régulation, des outils réglementaires, économiques, qui permettent de réguler la densité de qualité. Et puis enfin, des recommandations qui relèvent du champ des équipes de conception et des compétences et des approches qu'il faut promouvoir dans une perspective de densité de qualité. Alors pour ce dernier webinaire, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Rudiger Ahrend de l'OCDE qui, à travers finalement cette vision panoramique du monde des villes européennes et même à une échelle mondiale, va nous parler des déterminants économiques de la densité. Rudiger, c'est à vous.
So, thank you very much for this introduction. Welcome this afternoon, Rudiger. So, to start this webinar, we will do a short Mentimeter test. So, here, the participants, you can use your smartphones and putting the code that you can see right now. So, please use your smartphones and type in the number, or use a QR code in order to get us started and have a bit of an idea of who is here tonight. And unfortunately, there's only 35 people, but it's already a good start. So first of all, from very simple basics, from which city are you from? So already quite international, Switzerland, France, Norway. It's quite a good start. Only 9 participants out of the 35 answered. Okay, I guess we'll get to 20, then we can go to the next question. Okay, very good. I guess we can already go to the next question now. So who do you work for? The classic question. Private, public. Citizen association, for example. Okay, great. I think there's a good mixture, and we can already go to the next question. Well, as it's a webinar on the subject, I guess everybody already knows that answer. It's pretty, it's pretty straightforward. I don't think we should spend more time on that question. I think it's pretty clear. So we can go to the next slide, please. That's a tough one. That's quite a different question that you are used to have. À qui profite la densité? That's quite a tricky one. Maybe Rudiger, later on in the discussion, you'll be able to develop. Communities, yeah. That's quite an interesting question indeed. Okay, great. I believe we can move on. So yeah, promoters and collectivities, communities. And now a metropolitan governance question, which is quite important, especially here in Brussels region. Yeah, once again, we all know which direction we're going to. Indeed, importance of metropolitan governance. We can't stress that enough. I believe we can move on. So that was that. Thank you very much. Even though the questions was pretty straightforward and easy. Well, welcome, Mr. Ahrend. The floor is yours.
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll try to put on my slides. I hope this is working. So is this working? Is this fine? Okay, so as was mentioned before, I'll be talking about urban density and economics. So everything from an economic angle. I'm from the OECD, where I'm heading a division in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SME Cities and Regions. And I've been working on regional economics and urban economics for, more than 10, 12 years by now, basically. So a long-standing work record on that. So my presentation, I'll be first looking specifically at the issue of density and productivity. I'll be then talking about, what's the impact of density on sustainability, environmental sustainability and inclusiveness, social issues, basically. Then I'll say some words about the economics of high quality density. I'm sure you have heard a lot about high quality density in the previous seminars, but I just wanted to focus a bit on the economic angle. And then I'll say some words on governance, even though apparently maybe, that's something everybody already knows here. So basically, when you're talking about density and benefits and costs, you obviously have both in large cities. There are certain costs which are coming from agglomeration, from higher densities, which are, as you all know, congestion, pollution, can be crime inequality, also potentially higher housing prices. But there's also certain benefits from density. You're having basically larger markets for enterprises, larger labor markets. You're having a higher share of amenities or possibilities. Density allows to have better public transport systems. And density also allows to have a larger labor market, more choice, easier to find jobs, and also higher wages in principle. I'll come to that in a second. So basically, when I'm talking about productivity, in a way, productivity is a proxy for wages that can be paid. So productivity is a proxy for the living standards of the population, potentially. And in the long term, productivity is really very important, and it's the main determinant of the living standards of a country or a city. Now, why are we so much interested in productivity in urban agglomerations and cities? Well, the point is that basically, the largest share of the population is living in urban agglomerations these days. And especially in OECD countries, the share of GDP that's been created in the bigger agglomerations is typically 70–80% of the total GDP. So this really is a very substantial part of the whole economic production in a country. Also, what is interesting, important to understand is GDP per capita increases with city size. And what you can find is that basically when you have a city that's twice as large, twice as much population than another city, then the GDP per capita usually goes up by 10%. I have a little slide for you to see that. So you really see that generally speaking, when you look at larger cities, the productivity, the GDP per capita, which is, not exactly the same thing, but it's roughly roughly a similar measure when you're looking at cities. It really, is noticeably higher than in the smaller places, and this order of magnitude like 20–30% basically. And why do we have that? In fact, this is a result that is coming from sorting. What do I mean with sorting? With sorting, I mean that there's a tendency for people in bigger cities to be more highly educated. There's two reasons for that. For the first one, it's kind of like, with increasing city size, people tend to be more focused on acquiring higher levels of education. But then obviously there's also the effect that people with higher levels of education tend to come and live in the larger cities. So there's a sorting effect, which is explaining in part why you have higher levels of productivity in the bigger cities, but you can be controlling for that. You can kind of like make a thought experiment and crunching a lot of numbers. And so basically you are doing as if the population structure in each place in the country would be exactly the same. And then you're still seeing that productivity in cities increases with population size. Now you have a somewhat smaller effect. It's roughly half of the effect, so it's between 2 and 5%. So let's say order of magnitude 5%. more productivity for doubling in population. Now, obviously, that doesn't sound very much, but don't forget that kind of like, between a city of like 50,000 inhabitants and an agglomeration like Brussels or Paris, I mean, you're doubling several times. So if you're doing that, the calculation, I mean, you're ending up with potential productivity difference in the order of 20 or 30%. So that's quite sizable. I mean, as you can also see on this chart, I mean, there is a certain amount of variation at similar population levels. So I mean, the size of the population, the density is one important factor, but obviously there's certain others, and I'll come to some of that later. Now you may be asking, I mean, why is it that we're having this effect that I mean, larger cities are more productive? And there's typically, I mean, three main reasons why economists think that that's the case. I mean, the first one is that you have, I mean, larger labor markets, so you have a better matching. So that means basically enterprises can find workers that more exactly have the skills that they're looking for, or seen from the other point of view, workers can find jobs that are matching exactly what they want to do and what they're good at. And therefore, that basically has a better matching that increases, I mean, productivity levels. I mean, then you're having these sharing facilities. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, specialized institutions in cities. I mean, can be research institutions, can be legal institutions. I mean, there's a whole lot of them. And that also allows for, I mean, higher levels of productivity. Plus, which is also coming in this direction, I mean, if you're having a larger agglomeration, I mean, then you probably can find suppliers that are giving you inputs in your production that are more closely aligned what you're looking for. And if they're not too far away, you can also more easily work with them together. So that is also a benefit. And then the third point is that in the knowledge spillover. So basically you have, I mean, there is empirical evidence that basically, I mean, when you have increasing city sizes, people have larger networks. So there's more people you can meet. And so there's a kind of like, I mean, spillover of knowledge, I mean, between all these people that are meeting in these places. And so that also helps with productivity. I mean, that helps with innovation, creating ideas, and so on and so forth. Now, the effect on productivity I was talking about is obviously primarily linked to population sizes in cities, but it also has something to do with density. Because, for example, when you think about labor markets, I mean, the labor market is as large basically as where you can go to work. So I mean, if you're living in a city and it takes you like 2.5 hours to get some other place in the city to have a job, then at least before we had COVID and teleworking, that was basically no-go. So basically this kind of jobs were not in your labor market. So when you have cities which are very much spread out and having like bad transportation systems, then they're not really like, like a 10 million labor market, but it's more like you're having like, 1 million labor markets. So basically from a productivity agglomeration benefits point of view, it's more like you're having like, 10 1 million cities rather than if you're having like 1 10 million cities. So in that sense also, I mean, density helps to basically kind of like to make sure that your labor market is really large and that people can get to their jobs and their places. And for the knowledge spillovers, it's similar. I mean, it also kind of like in more denser places, I mean, you're more likely to meet more people. So there's also these knowledge spillovers will be likely higher. But as I said, I mean, this productivity agglomeration benefits from cities are not just coming from being, maximally dense, but it's also just coming from having large populations and large, I mean, numbers of enterprises in the same place, basically. Then the question arises, of course, I mean, who is benefiting from these agglomeration benefits, from this higher productivity that I was talking about? And then the situation is not that clear cut, because on the one hand, the wages in the cities are higher. So I mean, the production is higher. So from a national point of view, this is beneficial. But on the other hand, prices in cities also tend to be higher. So when you're looking at net wages, or what people can actually buy for their money, then you may find that basically the net wages may not be increasing that much, or may actually not be increasing the city size. So that depends a bit. Also, in the recent years, we have seen very strong increases in housing prices because of the shortages that we're having in most of the big cities. And that obviously then also has a negative effect on basically on the net wages of the people who are working in the cities. In a way, I mean, what this entails is that basically, I mean, owners of properties in those cities are capturing a very large part of the agglomeration benefits, which is maybe not actually what people would be thinking of as a fair situation. Then, last but not least, there's also differences across basically income levels. Typically, there's people with higher incomes that seem to be benefiting more from these agglomeration benefits than the people with lower incomes. And also in a situation where, I mean, the real wages may not be that much higher in cities. I mean, people may still be benefiting from being in the city because the amenities that are there, the possibilities, you know, to go to museums, cinemas, restaurants, and so on and so forth, they are there. But then also, I mean, it could be thought that individuals with higher levels of income and also higher levels of education may be more benefiting from these amenities. So it may also be a bit more biased in their sense, so that they are actually benefiting more from the agglomeration benefits that the city is generating. So that's what I wanted to say about the density and productivity, and now I wanted to turn to basically environmental and social issues. And the first point is, I mean, it's very clear that larger cities and especially compact cities are environmentally advantageous. I mean, there's a number of dimensions you can be looking at. I mean, this one is looking at car use, which is basically declining with city size. You can be looking at energy use for heating. You can be looking at sizes of buildings or kind of like your construction materials. I mean, most of these dimensions being in cities is beneficial from an environmental point of view compared to being with, like, I mean, smaller cities or being in the countryside where there is generally a higher consumption in all these dimensions. We've been doing a study at the OECD. We've been looking at, I mean, a number of studies that have been looking at that issue, kind of like a meta study, and the evidence on that is very clear. However, on the other side, so when you're having more compact cities, I mean, you're having these beneficial effects on the environment, but you're also having the problem that because of certain regulations that can have a negative effect on housing supply, you may also be increasing housing prices in more compact cities. And therefore, then, I mean, obviously, you're having a negative impact on inclusiveness, or you're having negative social effects from that. And this is a really very important issue, especially in the current situation where, I mean, housing prices, affordability of housing is a big topic in almost all the big cities already. And so kind of like if this is kind of like the shortage is further increased by restrictiveness and regulations, I mean, this is really problematic. So what we've been doing in the OECD, we've been doing a study, and you shouldn't read the details here. This is just to give you an idea of what we've been doing in that study. We've been looking at regulations basically, and we've been trying to see which are the regulations that are generally there to achieve compactness are actually achieving their goal of getting compactness. And what is then the impact on affordability? And when they are basically beneficial in both dimensions, then they are green. When this is not very clear, or when they're only beneficial in one dimension, then, I mean, we have kind of color-coded that in yellow. So that's basically policies where you should be really thinking a lot whether it's actually a smart idea of doing them. In a lot of cases, actually, that's things you should be avoiding, or where you need to be extremely careful in designing these policies. And then we have also a number of policies which are red. So I mean, those are the ones you really, I mean, shouldn't be doing in most circumstances. So this is, I mean, the reference to the paper is at the end of my presentation, but this is a really, really important paper that we've been doing at the OECD. And that I really recommend to all people who are in the situation where you're kind of like responsible for regulations. I mean, kind of like trying to achieve compactness, to kind of like look at that carefully so that you don't have this negative effects on affordability that otherwise can be occurring very easily. So then I wanted to say some words about the economics of high quality density. Of course, I mean, we are all in favor of high quality density. That's obvious. And obviously, I mean, high quality of density is needed. The problem being that obviously we don't want to have like maximum density everywhere, but kind of like in normal cities, you know, I mean, as most of you know, you're having a gradient, so you're having relatively high density in the city center, and then it's kind of like gradually decreasing when you get further out. Now the problem is large parts of cities are obviously old, and they were built when the cities were much smaller and when kind of like it made sense for them to have relatively low density. But that was like, 100 or 50 years ago, and things have changed since. And so, I mean, there really is this problem of kind of like creating greater densities in these places and to adapt the urban form to kind of like more modern build up, to more modern form, basically, of the density gradient in those places. And when we're doing that, obviously, we need to be very, it needs to be very important that we're having really the investment to basically have the high quality of the density. Because, I mean, what we see very often is that we are, when density has been created in the past, is that this was very low quality density, and that also explains why there's often a strong bias in the population. Where people think that, I mean, the only happy lives can be led in houses with garden around, and then whenever you have higher densities, I mean, this is actually kind of like, I mean, suboptimal and something that's I mean, it's just for people who can't afford anything else, and that obviously is problematic. We all know who are here that basically, I mean, you can have very fantastic living environments with high density, but that's actually something which is expensive and for which we need money for. And there's an interesting study by the World Bank, Pancakes to Pyramids, which is also a fantastic title, where they're basically showing that, I mean, if you want to do high density places well, I mean, firstly, you have to be a relatively rich country. So if you're a low income country, basically, as soon as you're starting to have high densities, basically you're having crowding. And so that's important to understand. And the second point I wanted to make is kind of like, given that it is costly to create quality density, there is a means for financing that which is really underexploited, and that's land value capture. And typically when you're creating higher density in cities, I mean, that's the moment where a lot of land value increases appear, because if you're having 1-story or 2-story buildings and you allow, that they kind of like be transformed in, I don't know, 5 or 6 levels of floors basically on top, I mean, you're creating a lot of value basically. And there's no reason why the developer should be capture all that value, because I mean, it's basically coming from public regulations that this create this value. And that's also coming to the question that was asked in the beginning. I mean, obviously, if you don't have land value capture, I mean, then you may be in a situation where a lot of the value from density is going to the developers. But basically, there are the tools, there's the possibilities with land value capture tools to basically make sure that a lot of that value is going to the community. And if this is done, then obviously, I mean, there's a material change. Now, unfortunately, in most OECD countries, we're having a study forthcoming on that. Land value capture is not being used as much as it should be. And that's also the case in Belgium, but that really is an area where there could be higher use, and that would really be helping in making density high quality, which, as I mentioned earlier, obviously is very important. Now, the last topic that I wanted to touch is on governance, metropolitan governance, which apparently, I mean, you're all very aware of, but the most audience I talk to, I mean, that's an issue they really haven't thought about. And the problem is that in the most metropolitan areas, I mean, they are highly fragmented. I mean, they can be fragmented in several dimensions. The one we have been focusing on in the study is the fragmentation by being fragmented in a large number of municipalities. And as I'm saying on that slide, I mean, there's more than 10 local governments in 75% of the OECD metropolitan areas. And there's almost a quarter of them that have more than 100 municipalities. And if you need to coordinate, among 100 municipalities, I mean, that really is near impossible. Now, there's other forms of fragmentation, of course. I mean, there is the area, especially when urban areas are split between several regions or states. I mean, for example, I mean, Chicago is split between 3 states. Hamburg metropolitan area is split between 4 Länder in Germany. And I mean, you all know that also, I mean, the Belgium urban area is also split between 3 regions, basically. And that also, I mean, is creating, I mean, a lack of cooperation, is creating negative externalities, and this is potentially leading to suboptimal situations. One example maybe that I'll tell you about is kind of like, I mean, it was a city, one of the major international airports, And when we arrived, we were struck to find that there was no decent train connections between the airport and the city center. So we asked our counterparts, why don't you have a decent train connection? They were saying, it's costly. And we say, look, come on, you're not that poor. You can, in Latin America, they're building trains. You can afford building a train, basically. And so they were saying, to be honest, kind of like the problem is we try to build one, but the problem is, the mayors along the train line, they have actually a veto power. And the mayors who were close to the airport, they were saying, look, our citizens here, they don't really need the train because they can almost walk to the airport, and it's making noise, so I don't think we should build it. And that's where the whole thing stopped, and that's obviously a disaster for the urban area. And this is just like one example of kind of like showing you why basically this fragmentation can be so negative for the quality of life and also the productivity of the metropolitan areas. And so we've also did a certain amount of number crunching, and we showed therefore that beyond the case studies that we had been doing, that there's also a very systematic effect. So basically, when your metropolitan area is strongly fragmented, so what we are measuring here is like when you're having like twice as much municipalities per 100,000 inhabitants, then you're losing 6% of your productivity. And that's quite sizable because, you remember we had like 2 to 5% gains from agglomeration benefits earlier. So basically, when you're having very bad governance structures, you can easily lose all the productivity benefits, that you're actually getting from being a large agglomeration. So, we're really talking very, very serious damages here. And we also did some other research where we showed that basically when you had more fragmented places, basically the quality of the public transport systems was much lower, and you also had much higher pollution levels, probably connected to a larger level of car use in such situations. So the point I'm trying to make here really is kind of like that fragmentations in the metropolitan areas is a huge problem in almost all of the OECD countries. What we also showed is when you're having what we call a metropolitan governance body, so that's kind of like an institution who in certain areas has the right to decide for the metropolitan area, or at least for large parts of the metropolitan area, something like bigger London or something like that you can think, and then the situation materially improves. And so we've been strongly advocating having these metropolitan governance bodies. What do we think are the areas where you need to have like a decision being taken at the metropolitan level? So we think that's basically transport, that's land use. And I think also it is housing, because otherwise you have a lot of NIMBYism and not in my backyard type of organizations and also municipality behavior. And therefore I think this is really important. So with this, I wanted to thank you. This is a certain number of publications we've been doing at the OECD. I think they are all freely either downloadable or at least freely accessible on the internet. So I invite you to have a look at them. And the paper I was specifically mentioned on kind of like, what's the impact of regulation on housing affordable when you're kind of like trying to have a compact urban city. This is the one Moreno, Monregas, Matsumoto, and so forth. It's the the fourth one from the bottom, and I really recommend this to your attention. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rudiger, for this very interesting presentation. And as I like to remember all, of course, this presentation will be put online so we can have a second watch and have more details about the different various publications Rudiger is talking about. So I will let Jérôme Baratier start with the questions. Jérôme, c'est à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Ahrend, pour ce panorama très complet des avantages économiques ou des déterminants économiques de la densité. Je voulais revenir sur, et Nicolas fera une petite traduction pour nos auditeurs internationaux, notamment sur la question de la gouvernance. C'est-à-dire qu'il apparaît que les bénéfices de la densité sont à la grande échelle. C'est-à-dire c'est l'effet marché, c'est l'effet métropolitain finalement, quand les coûts, en tout cas les désavantages de la densité semblent être plutôt à une échelle plus restreinte. Et Donc ça, c'est les deux échelles, coût et avantage, coût, bénéfice et désavantages. Et vous notez par ailleurs la fragmentation de la gouvernance dans la plupart des cas. Selon vous, la question, il n'y a aucune malice, mais elle n'est pas facile, évidemment. Comment on réduit cette distance entre les échelles des coûts et celles des bénéfices? Est-ce que ça passe par des régulations de type économique ou est-ce que ça passe d'abord par des régulations de type politique et administrative?
So basically, not an easy question to translate, but I'll do my best. It's really a costs versus scale and regulation of governance. How do you simplify and take down the costs on a metropolitan scale?
I think the benefits are also, I mean, occurring in part at the metropolitan scale, but they're also occurring in smaller cities already. So kind of like, you know, when you're going from we're talking about, you know, increasing city size basically. So when you're going from 50,000 to 100,000, you're having the same increase in productivity when you're going from 5 million to 10 million. So I mean, in a way, you're having a lot more potential for increasing your productivity when you're a smaller place than when you're already kind of like 5 or 10 million, because I mean, you really need to have enormous population growth to basically get additional productivity benefits. So in that sense, you're already having that at the smaller scale. But it's true that there is this issue that a lot of the costs are maybe, I mean, you need a lot more local action for the costs, but not only. I mean, you also, I mean, when you're looking at transport, I mean, when you're looking at pollution levels, for example, I mean, obviously, I mean, there are local dimensions here, but I mean, you also need a plan for the whole metropolitan area, which is kind of like, you know, I mean, making the the overarching transport connections, transport lines, I mean, feasible and kind of like just, you know, in an efficient way, basically. So I think that also on the cost side, I mean, there is quite important issues that need to be sorted out at the metropolitan level.
Okay, and here I have a question from Peter Austin. So is there international evidence of taxation policies, an example, amending tax relief on real estate investments, which could improve the course towards high quality and accessible density, or fiscal policy in general?
I mean, we'll be coming out with our report on land value capture next year, and then all the details will be in there. Land value capture can take various forms. I mean, some are closer to taxation, others are more like negotiations with developers. But generally speaking, I mean, there's multiple ways where you can make sure that basically in exchange for certain development rights or in exchange for certain infrastructure that's being constructed and that benefits you know, more adjacent buildings and places, that in exchange for that, then developers or owners kind of like make a contribution. I mean, either kind of like pay a tax, or kind of like, I mean, often what is negotiated is the developers, for example, provide a certain share of the apartments as social housing, or that they need to provide certain infrastructures, they need to do a certain amount of greening. I mean, there's various ways how this can be done. I mean, my main point being kind of like that this is something which is not done enough in most places. I mean, now, I mean, that may depend on each single development, and maybe sometimes it is, but the general, I mean, the general feeling is that because, I mean, people may be feeling that their property rights are entangled when you're doing this land value capture, but in a way they're not, because basically what you're trying to do is kind of like the public intervention, which is increasing value, and without that the owners or the developers have been doing anything, and therefore it from a fairness point of view, it's totally normal, totally acceptable that, I mean, this windfall in a way gets taxed away, taxing in a large sense, so it gets taken away and made available for the community as a whole.
And regarding land value capture, do you have any successful international examples?
I mean, there's a number of examples. I mean, there is, for example, in certain Latin American cities where they have been selling air rights of buildings. So that's basically kind of like, I mean, if you, so if you were owner of the land,
like in New York.
Yeah, you kind of like, I mean, being owner of the land only gave you the right to build kind of like one floor or something, and everything else you basically needed to buy. And then this has been organized in different ways. I mean, you can have like, I mean, auctions, you can have be kind of like transferable air rights and things like that. I mean, then there's also kind of like in, there's other types of that. For example, in Korea, Japan, often when there's been developments, what has been done is kind of like that. I mean, developers have been obliged to really provide a very large amount of infrastructure in exchange for basically getting building rights in these parts. So I mean, there's lots of examples in different countries and different places are doing different things well. And then obviously it depends a bit on what the legal system in a country is and what the tradition is. I mean, some things are more acceptable to some people in some countries than in others. In France also, I mean, there's a lot of ways where land value has been captured. It can also be that kind of like, I mean, you're expropriating a certain amount of land outside of areas where you're going to build infrastructure at the price basically before, you know, the building of the infrastructure became known. And in that way also then, I mean, you capture the value of that. So I mean, there's very things that are being done, and so I mean, there's a whole panoply of good examples. The problem being, I mean, that they're not applied sufficiently regularly.
Okay, and moving onto examples as we are talking about. Could you give us some examples regarding to you about successful urban density, as you have analyzed and studied a lot of cities worldwide?
I mean, I guess, I mean, you just need to think about which are cities that are attractive and where people want to live, and which are relatively dense. I mean, sometimes there's some cities which are not very dense that are popular with people, but I mean, Paris, for example, is a city which is very dense, which is very popular, where people want to be. Amsterdam is another city like that. Then certain, it's a different, how shall I say, it's a different, it comes to different preferences, but certain cities in Korea and Japan are also very attractive and extremely well done for compact cities. Now, it's also that in recent years, I mean, a lot of movements have been going in the right direction. I mean, just give you one example, for example, and that's I mean, there's also kind of like, because of COVID, there's certain advances have been made. I mean, bike lanes have been built, and for example, in Paris, a lot of parking space has been transformed into outside restaurants. And that also is kind of like making a city much more livable, much more attractive. So in a way, that also kind of like makes density a lot more attractive.
And moving on to some other questions here. So how can you impose taxes and avoid increasing the price of the square meter?
Well, to the degree that you're basically, I mean, taxing away a windfall gain to developers, I don't see the problem. And what you're doing when you're kind of like putting in land value capture is, I mean, you are decreasing the windfall that is going to the owner of the land, basically. And so, I mean, so that there's no necessity that increases the price of the square meter, because I mean, either basically, I mean, if a developer was the owner of the land, then they would have gotten a windfall. But if somebody, but then if somebody else had been owning the land, so that basically means that developer will be buying the land from that owner more cheaply. And so I mean, there is no. I mean, as long as there's competition basically in the market for construction, there's no reason why this would be increasing the square meter price. And even if it was, I mean, if you're kind of like getting a lot of the land value captured away for social purposes, then you can easily, I mean, it will only take a fraction of that money to basically, I mean, to basically, I mean, compensate poorer parts of the society to be able to live in these places. So that's
okay.
so, I mean, so that really isn't the problem.
All right, moving on to Peter Austin, that has some fair points. So he really thinks that it's important that your OECD study concludes that land value capture should be applied more often and with greater ambition. And what's the strength of the message that you can give to leaders and lawmakers? And do they listen to you?
Look, I mean, we're not the first ones to have said that, and land value capture is also not something that's new. I mean, I remember kind of like, I mean, when I looked at the Habitat 2, which was like, you know, basically kind of like 25 years back now, then people were already also talking about land value capture. Now the how shall I say? I mean, there's maybe more of an urgency these days. Firstly. And secondly, also, I mean, we are really, I mean, we're making a compendium where for each country, we're really kind of like, I'm very clearly exposing the situation. We're exposing what kind of like, I mean, what kind of like instruments are being used in that country. And we're also doing that in a way where things are internationally comparable. So we are, in a way, we have been inventing a whole language. We have been doing that together with Lincoln. We have been inventing a whole terminology because that didn't exist before. So that, I mean, for the first time, people will be really able to kind of like understand what their country is doing in the international context, and they will be able to see what other countries are doing that they could be copying for their country. So we hope that from at a technical level, this will really, I mean, enable those who want to use land value capture to do this, I mean, more seriously and help them in doing that. I mean, beyond that, I mean, we will also be willing to do kind of like specific studies for specific places to give them concrete examples of land value capture tools they could be applying beyond that. But generally speaking, we are not expecting that it will be kind of like, you know, making the first page of the Financial Times, because I mean, it still is a kind of like more of a niche topic. But we think for those who are aware of this and who want to find a tool that can allow them to basically build infrastructure in their cities and make their cities a better place to live. I mean, this is a really important publication, and then they will have practical value from basically going forward and implementing these in their places.
Okay, so basically really working on a new tool of financing quality density.
Not only, but also, yes.
So as you underline the importance of infrastructure in order regarding the city post-COVID, is it all about making the model of the metropolitan city more attractive?
I mean, during the COVID crisis, obviously the attractiveness of cities has been taking a bit of a hit. Because, I mean, as we all know, I mean, one of the attractions of the cities is all the amenities that you have there. And during a year and a half, basically, I mean, those were by and large closed down. And moreover, people were often forced to be staying in their what typically are relatively small apartments compared to rural areas. Because, I mean, the life in cities is a life which is much more outside the, you know, the borders of your own apartments, because, I mean, there's all these places, amenities around you, basically. And that has disappeared, and that has certainly, I mean, certain people have therefore decided that they would rather prefer to live further out, either further out in suburbs or even further out in really rural areas. And then the second effect, obviously, is that teleworking has been developing in the sense that we all know how to use Zoom tools and Teams and all these different softwares, which before the crisis was basically, I mean, it was not widespread knowledge. So it was, I mean, it was not really able to tell. I mean, it was almost impossible to efficiently telework on a larger scale. And these days that has become important and impossible. And therefore, I mean, this allows people to live more where they want to live. And if there's people who rather prefer to live in an urban in a rural environment, and who had been living in the cities mainly because of their workplace, I mean, they may now have the possibility to move further out. So in a way, I mean, that's posing an issue for two reasons. Because firstly, this will put increasing stress on sprawl. Because kind of like living, you know, like an hour and a half outside of the city is less of an issue if you only need to commute into the city like once or twice a week and not 5 times. So there really is an issue, kind of like a strong force that's pushing towards sprawl. And it may also be an issue in the sense that maybe cities have becoming a bit less attractive. I personally don't think that that's going to be a long-lasting issue. I mean, unless we have like, I mean, recurring pandemics like COVID every 5 years, which would be a total game changer. But I mean, assuming we're going back to a relatively normal life in cities after the crisis, then I would think the reasons why people have been coming to the cities in the first place, they'll still be there. But in a way, the competition from rural areas is getting tougher. And that's also why I think cities will need to further increase, I mean, their attractiveness, especially in the sense of being livable and kind of being green and having a higher level of well-being for their citizens.
And what are the studies regarding sprawl? Have you made those studies regarding economic performance, environmental performance, social performance of urban sprawl?
I mean the studies on the environmental performance of urban sprawl, I think they are relatively clear. I mean, urban sprawl is not good from an environmental point of view, because I mean it's higher use.
But lately, with the new ways of working, you still haven't had the time to.
No, that's impossible, because I mean we're only just starting to see, I mean, the population movements, and it's really difficult also to know how much of, you know, I mean, there's less people who have coming into the big cities to rent apartments, but you really don't know whether that's just kind of like, you know, they didn't come for a year and they'll come like, you know, in September they'll come back, whether that's a real trend. So I mean, it's just not possible to do any serious empirical studies for the time being. And
here I have a question from Julia. Maybe you can help us have a better view on that. Well, if you have any, what's the best practice for the urban periphery with very low density?
I mean, the issue, of course, is when you're having very, I mean, not telling you newsy, when you're having very low density, I mean, you basically can't organize public transport in an efficient way. Maybe you can do that one day when we're having self-driving cars, and then we can have lots of minibuses. But I mean, for the time being, basically, I mean, that basically means there's a very large level of car use. Now, when we have increasingly having electric cars, I mean, that's making the situation somewhat less bad. But I mean, still the resource use of people living further out in less densely populated areas will be higher. Now there's reasons why people want to live there. So I mean, it's also kind of like, in a way, it's the right to choose where they want to live. But I mean, then also we need to make sure that, I mean, they're not putting negative externalities on other parts of the cities or the society. So I mean, in a way, how should I say? I mean, my view on that is kind of like that people, I mean, they can live wherever they want as long as this is in line with regulations and the law. But there's no reasons why a society needs to sponsor them to be able to live wherever they want.
So here we have a question from our colleague Alfredo Corbalan from the International Office. So good metropolitan cooperation is key, of course, we all agree with that. Do you have any good example of metropolitan cooperation on spatial planning in the context of a federal state that could inspire Brussels, where its metropolitan area is spread over in 3 different regions?
I mean, what they've been doing in Frankfurt Rhein-Main is not too bad. It's also kind of like it's encompassing at least 2 länder. And it's in a situation where, I mean, the possibilities of having kind of like strong institutions are politically not really there. Then obviously kind of like if you have examples like, I mean, like Portland, where you have metropolitan areas where you even have like an elected official who's leading the metropolitan area. I mean, that gives a whole new dimension of possibilities. But I'm not a specialist in Belgium, but I'm not sure that this is on the political cards anytime soon.
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. Will we wait for a couple of last questions? Anyhow, Jérôme, anything from you?
Non, écoutez, juste pour à nouveau remercier Rudiger de son expertise et de montrer que la densité, c'est aussi un rapport de force économique et que la question, c'est la création de la valeur et qui récupère la valeur créée. Et je note la convergence de nos différents webinaires quand Rudiger nous dit la densité de haute qualité, elle passe par un espace public de très haute qualité. En effet, cet espace public de très haute qualité, il a un coût. Et la question, c'est qui supporte le coût, sachant qu'on est à des échelles territoriales, évidemment, qui se télescopent dans nos affaires de métropolisation. En tout cas, ça semble une pierre à l'édifice tout à fait centrale. Et cet édifice, eh bien, on est en train d'essayer de le terminer pour proposer à la rentrée, probablement, une sorte de carnet de recommandations qui à la fois nous récapitulera ce qu'on a entendu lors de notre saison de webinaires, nos 6 webinaires, qui aussi donnera quelques idées sur la mesure de la densité de qualité, de la qualité urbaine et densité, quelle donnée, quelle valeur, comment on convoque le sensible, et puis aussi ces recommandations qui seront illustrées par des éléments de benchmark, comme l'a fait Rudiger avec talent aujourd'hui, en allant piocher, oui, à Portland, à Berlin, etc. Des approches qui permettraient à la région de Bruxelles-Capitale de se forger, si ce n'est une nouvelle doctrine, en tout cas d'expérimenter de nouvelles pratiques, puisque c'est vraiment ça, je crois que c'est le sens même de projecting.brussels, qui est d'être une planification intelligente, agile, qui permet d'adapter en permanence le cadre stratégique et surtout de tenter d'expérimenter des modes de faire, des modes de gouvernance nouveaux. C'est essai-erreur, il faut expérimenter, en tirer les conclusions et le cas échéant, essayer d'élargir. Voilà, moi je me réjouis qu'on ait pu parler d'économie et pas simplement de forme urbaine. On limite trop souvent la densité à la question de la forme urbaine, de la hauteur, de l'architecture. On dirait parfois que c'est une question d'architecte et de paysagiste. C'est aussi évidemment une question de marché, de valeur, de péréquation et de gouvernance. Et je trouve que votre intervention, Monsieur Ahrend, elle était salvatrice en ce sens. Voilà, Nicolas.
So to quickly translate this very short sentence that Jerome just had, regarding the end of this webinar, we would like to remind you that by the autumn, most probably, we will, with all these information we gathered and all these exchanges we had, we will come up with a practical solutions booklet on governance, on economical aspects, on architectural aspects of how to manage a quality density. It's still a trying period because there's no perfect answer. But what we can already come up with some conclusions regarding quality of life and urban density is that the public space has to be of a very high level, has to be very qualitative. And unfortunately, that's something that has a huge burden on society as a whole. It has a cost. So, of course, we would like to thank Rudiger to come up with a more pragmatic vision of how urban density and quality of life is done, because there is also, of course, the economical aspects of the markets, of value, of land value, and it's not just a job of landscapers and architects. So once again, thank you very much all for being here tonight. We will stop a bit shortly. We'll make it shorter, as this evening is already taking its time. And please find us again on our website, projecting.brussels. This discussion, this debate will be quickly put online. All the people that have signed in through our Google form will receive our newsletter and will receive a link to the video once it'll be put online. And from all of us here at perspective.brussels, I want to thank you so much for your time. And that's a wrap. Julia, last words? Le son.
Mais je vais toutes les questions en tous nos webinaires. Je pense qu'on a vu la densité à travers 360 degrés.
Donc aujourd'hui, on a vraiment parlé de volet économique qui est le point clé finalement. Et donc je pense que malgré que il y a auditoire n'est pas autant large qu'on avait par exemple dans le premier webinaire, mais je pense qu'on va faire une diffusion qui est assez large. Donc, comme ça, on va passer ces messages-là au public assez large via YouTube. Et je vous invite aussi à regarder donc les documents qu'on va sortir. Ils sont tous publiés et toujours affichés sur notre site donc perspective et en particulier donc projecting.brussels. Donc voilà, je vous invite à consulter aussi tout ce qu'on produit pour vous mieux informer de ce qu'on va faire avec la densité par après.
Just a quick reminder to visit our website, perspective.brussels. We will find all the different analysis and studies we've been doing for this season of Projecting Brussels. Thank you all. Dank u wel voor deze avond. En merci beaucoup à tous et bon match pour certains. Merci.